So, sex ed is done in very different ways in different ages and in different places, but you guys have all agreed to be grown-ups in a grown-up class, so I'm going to treat you as grown-ups. And if you all are not over 18, then by virtue of taking a college class, you agreed to be treated as if you were. So that's going to be my assumption. And so one of the things that I want to sort of tell you is where I'm coming from. First of all, I'm from Texas. I was educated in an abstinence-only sex education state, so I had a hell of a lot to learn as I became an adult. And we are going to get into some things that are out of my realm of expertise, and when we are in those, I will tell you that I'm out of my realm of expertise. The only reason I'm doing it, for instance, if we talk about how you can become transgender or what homosexuality means, it's not because I think that I am the expert on those things, but it's because this may be the only time that you could have this discussion, right? With a scientific basis, right? And the opportunity to ask questions, the opportunity for me to be educated and you to be educated. And then, of course, most of the time we're going to stick to the anatomy and physiology. My history with like teaching it the way that I do and learning it the way that I do is that twofold. First of all, I have a 12-year-old. I had to deeply educate myself about how he was going to be educated in Utah, which was fascinatingly different than I ever imagined. So if you are interested in this as a parent living here or anywhere, the Guttmacher Institute actually assesses sex education, HIV education, and teen pregnancy rates and STI rates, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Okay, they compile the data worldwide. And of course, when my son started being educated, I wanted to know how he was being educated so I could fill in the gaps, right? Okay, so one of the things that I figured out about Utah, okay, is that Utah has some interesting things that they do. First off, please note that not even all states mandate sex education at all. And in Utah, I think we talked about this before, Utah does some relatively interesting things. One of the things, see that little squiggle right there? Utah is absolutely the only state that prohibits the educators from answering direct, fact-based questions when the kids ask them. So let me just give you an example. Utah prohibits mentions of condoms. If I have a kid, 15 years old, taking this in 9th grade or 8th grade, who asked, do condoms prevent STIs under certain circumstances? And there are data to show when it does and when it doesn't and what you're talking about. Since condoms are not part of the curriculum in Utah, that person has to not answer questions, right? So even fact-based questions, and you can't even give them literature or resources. You can't do it here in Utah. In addition, there are some interesting things that Utah does as well. Look at Texas. Oh my gosh, that's where I was educated. Look at all the things Texas doesn't do. And we have one of the highest teen pregnancy rates anywhere. So interestingly, some states prohibit promoting religion in public school sex education, which we can argue about. Utah also has some other important things. We can't talk about sexual orientation here. We can't talk about condoms here. In addition, please note that in Utah, you do not talk about contraception. Your kids get zero education about contraception. And depending on which county you are in Utah, it can be even more restrictive than that. In, not surprisingly, Utah County, they are not allowed to mention the existence of sex outside of a heterosexual marriage. It doesn't even exist, which is probably some confusing to some of the kids whose parents aren't married. So this is the starting point that I had. And then my other starting point was just a point of humility in which I had a class a few years ago in which I taught the reproductive system, and I had a student who was transgender who came up and very politely told me that I was using some terminology incorrectly. And she was right. So I went and did some literature research. I read all of the journal articles that I could find, both anatomy, physiology, and also psychology, so that I could get as close as I could to the correct use of terminology while still realizing that I'm probably getting things wrong, but I'll get them more right the next time I do it. So if you guys know things that I don't know, please feel free to educate me. And so we're going to start at the very beginning by talking about some stuff that I didn't learn for a really long time, which is how you got to be a sex at all. Yes? And what is the difference between sex and gender, right? So you can't use them interchangeably. So first off, the thing that I was doing is using the term sex and gender interchangeably. And that's not appropriate to do because sex has to do with your biological traits, which is most of where we're going to focus because that's my area of expertise, right? Okay. But gender is also an interesting question. Gender is your social identity, which is how you interact with the world, right? Okay. Sometimes those agree and sometimes they don't. Okay. And we'll talk about some theories about how that can occur today. So let's start with biological sex, okay? There are at least 5 determinants of biological sex, and these are things that most of us agree on. Some people say that there are more than 5, but let's start with the 5 that everybody can sort of agree on. And that 5 determinants of your biological sex. And one of them is your sex chromosomes, XX or XY. Everybody with me on that? Okay. Typically speaking, XX is female, XY is male in humans, but just so you know, it's actually not that simple. Because if you're XO, you're actually female. If you're XYYY, you're actually male, right? If you're XXXXX, you're actually female. But if you're XXXXXY, you're actually male. So there is more variation between that than people allow and people accept or people argue about on Facebook, right? Because they don't know a damn thing. If it comes in a sound bite, somebody doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay. So there are your sex chromosomes. There are also your gonads. Your gonads are your ovaries and testes. Those, however, are homologous structures. Do you know the word homologous? Homologous means same evolutionary or embryonic root. So for instance, my arm and a bird's wing are homologous structures. My ovaries, my husband's testes are homologous structures. They come from the same anatomical embryological root. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, there are also your sex hormones, and that means after puberty, for instance, do you have a preponderance of estrogens or a preponderance of androgens, including testosterone? Is that okay? Okay, you all have both, FYI. It's just which one are you more heavily, which one do you have more of? Does that make sense? Okay, and by the way, there is some variation. It's not like, oh, you get to X level of estrogen and then we say you're a female, right? Or you get to X level of testosterone. For instance, I have had my testosterone tested. I am a pretty damn high testosterone woman, right? It tends to manifest in being relatively assertive, which if you don't like me, you will call aggressive. Right? And so a lot of times there are relatively high estrogen men, relatively low estrogen men, and so there's a lot of variation in that. Okay, so sex hormones. And then also, let's talk about your anatomy. When you get to your anatomy, there's your internal organ anatomy in your pelvic cavity primarily, okay, not exclusively. And then your external genitalia, so your internal reproductive anatomy and your external reproductive anatomy. So what I want to talk about right now is how you get to those two, which is related to these, okay? So it's all sort of part of one story, the whole anatomic sex differentiation. So let's look at it. It's pretty damn interesting, and I was not taught this stuff. I had to learn it as an adult. So here's the deal. All of us, regardless of what sex you are now, started out as an indeterminate sex anatomically. Even though you were probably XX or XY, there is a period of time during development which your anatomy could become either female or male, because we started out with internal duct work, right? That could become male or female. So let me introduce you to the internal ductwork. Just a second, I'll get you, Alice. The internal ductwork, all of these pink ducts right here, do you see them? Pink ducts. If you support their continued development, they will become oviducts, fallopian tubes, and a uterus. Okay, those are called the paramesonephric ducts or the Mullerian ducts. Okay, just keep those in mind for just a second. But you also, regardless of your sex now, started out with the purple ducts, and the purple ducts are called the mesonephric ducts or Wolffian ducts. If those continue their development, they will become the vas deferens and the seminal vesicles and part of the male reproductive tract. And we all started out with both. So if you are pregnant, do you ever try to determine the sex of the baby before 10 weeks? Right? You can't really determine a damn thing, and it doesn't actually have an anatomical sex yet. It could be either one. Does that make sense to you guys? What was your question, Alice?
So you said that our chromosomes are already set.
Yes.
But our anatomy is going to be our sexual anatomy.
Yes.
Is yet to be determined. So the XX or the XY, that plays into.
Yes, we're about to tell the whole story, like a short version of the whole story. It goes chromosomes, ducts, hormones, anatomy. And we're about to tell the whole story in just a second. Okay? Okay? Ready? So, to remember, by the way, which one does which? If you saw a cartoon and it had a wolf in it, is it more likely to be male or female? Male. That's how I remember. I'm not trying to be sexist. I just remember Wolffian Ducts as male, and then the Mullerian ducts are the other one, right? So yeah, I like just a way to remember which one's going to be which. Okay, so let's start talking about how you get from here to an actual anatomical sex, right? And so you have to work on the internal ductwork, and then you work on the outside external genitalia, okay? So it's actually pretty damn interesting, and it's pretty damn interesting, especially when it like develops like differently than normal. So here's the deal. So we are going to end up with some homologous structures because basically males and females both started out the same, and you can differentiate depending on different hormonal environments. So the first thing is the ovaries and the testes are homologous structures. They're the same structure that developed in different hormonal environments. Everybody okay with that? Okay. The testes, of course, are not going to stay up there in a typical male. They're going to descend, but they are the same anatomical structure. Okay? Everybody okay with that? And then others that you may or may not know, the glans penis, the tip of the penis, right, is homologous with the glans clitoris, the tip of the clitoris. We can almost say that the penis and the clitoris are homologous with the exception of the fact that there's like some erectile structures that don't end up in the clitoris that end up in the penis. And of course the urethra doesn't end up in the clitoris, right? Okay, so it's not quite as if the penis is the same as the clitoris, but almost, and we'll get to that today, okay? And then the scrotum, which of course surrounds the testes in an adult male, is the homologous structure with the labia majora. And then there are also some internal structures that you might not know about yet that are homologous, and I'll teach you those as we go through, right? Okay, so I want to talk about how you get to be a sex. It's pretty damn interesting, really. In humans, the real difference is the presence or absence of the Y chromosome. Okay, can we all agree that just if we're all typical chromosomal humans, all of us have an X chromosome? As a matter of fact, you're actually not even viable as a human if you don't have an X chromosome. So all of us have an X chromosome. So the real difference is whether you have a Y or not. Yes? Okay. So all of the research that we have done on, for instance, model organisms that have the same sex differentiation system as we do, right? A lot of mammals do, not all of them, okay, have shown us, and then also some anecdotal evidence with humans with certain disorders and certain things that they happen to do to one another, show us that basically what happens is the Y chromosome is really going to start the differentiation of a male. And so one of the things that we have figured out is really the default anatomical sex in humans is female. If you do not do anything, you are going to develop more like a female than like a male. Will you be reproductively viable? Probably not, but you are going to look female and perhaps identify as female. We'll get to that question in just a second. So here's the deal. To become a male, what you are going to have to do is you are going to have to flip 2 switches. To become a female, just pretty much leave it alone, and that's pretty much what's going to happen. Okay, so eventually if you are going to become a male, you need to go from here, and you are going to need to disintegrate the pink ducts, yeah? And then tell this, make male stuff, yes? Internally, right? These should become testes, and eventually they should start to drop, right? These should become vas deferens, seminal vesicle. You'll have to develop a prostate gland and all of that kind of stuff. So let's go over what actually happens. They have figured out, through people who actually have mutations, that the anatomical differentiation to male begins when a gene called the Sry gene, which is only on the Y chromosome and not on the X chromosome, activates. And it activates at about 5 to 6 weeks post-implantation. This is about 7 weeks after you had sex-ish, yeah? Because it can take up to a week for implantation to occur. Are we okay? So if this baby, this fetus, has a Y chromosome, what's going to happen is the SRY gene will turn on at about that point in development. And one of the things that the SRY gene does is it begins to initiate the testes development. But here's something interesting. The reason dudes have nipples when they don't really use them is because nipple development actually occurs before sex differentiation. Yeah, it's earlier in development. So the presence of your nipples, men, means that you almost were a girl. So if you know somebody who's really sexist, just remind them about their nipples. Just like, what you got there? Okay, so what we did now is we just sort of turned on we made the gonads decide now it's time to become testes, and it was the Y chromosome that told them that, right? So they're going to start to initiate testes development, and then the testes are going to activate a hormone called MIH, which is Mullerian inhibiting hormone. And what do you think Mullerian inhibiting hormone does? It stops the development of the Mullerian ducts, and it causes disintegration of the Mullerian ducts. Is that okay? And so the pink ducts start to disintegrate. But all of this was initiated ultimately by the presence of the Y chromosome, right? Okay. And then what's going to happen here is as these testes start differentiation, this interaction between the maternal hormones and the fetal hormones will continue to support the development of the male. And those of us who have had little boys, do you know that you actually have circulating testosterone in your body when you are impregnated with a male? Did you guys know that? It's lipid soluble, and he's making testosterone, and it actually goes through the placenta, and sometimes your sex drive goes through the roof when you are pregnant with a male, right? Does that make sense to you guys? So he starts to make little baby testosterone. So he starts to make little baby testosterone. So the placental hormones will sort of communicate with the fetal gonads, and he's going to secrete sex hormones during pregnancy. So the other thing that happens when MIH and the whole testosterone little system start going is that it will also cause the testes to continue their maturation and start their descent, yeah? And then it will cause the external genitalia to start deciding that, okay, here's the external genitalia, here's what we all started out looking. This is about week 6 post-development. And so as we start to go down, the homologous structures are the same color. You ready? Okay, so what will happen is really this is the default. If you don't do anything to it, you are going to end up developing like this, okay? But with the presence of a Y chromosome, therefore MIH and then testosterone, what's going to happen is you will say, oh, this was going to become a clitoris, now let's make a glans penis. Yes? Okay. This was going to become labia majora, but I want it to differentiate into a scrotum. Yes? Okay. These were going to become labia minora, but now I want you to differentiate into the skin that covers the shaft of the penis. Right? That makes sense? Okay. And this is all not because of the absence of testosterone or the absence of estrogen, but because of the presence of testosterone. Right? So do you see why they say the default anatomical sex in humans is female? Okay. Okay. But there is, by the way, a little bit more to it than that. We all basically were going to develop this way, and we would all have developed with a blind vagina. Everybody started out with a vagina. Everybody did. Males actually got co-opted into other structures, but everybody kind of started out this way. But you will not actually develop fallopian tubes, oviducts, and a functional uterus unless at this point, when it decided not to become a male, those ovaries actually support the continued development of a female by at some point producing estrogen. So if these don't work, right, you're going to end up with basically just a vagina that goes to here, yeah? It doesn't have a functional uterus, so you couldn't have a pregnancy, right? So kind of the default anatomical sex is female, but it's not necessarily a reproductively viable female. Does that make sense? Okay, so how you got a sex. So what kind of evidence do we have of this? Well, we have evidence from model organisms, like I said. But the other evidence that we have is pretty damn interesting. So anatomical maleness seems to be the presence of testosterone, androgens, at a certain really crucial point in development. Basically, between like weeks 5 and 8, you have to have a surge of testosterone, right? Okay. Anatomical femaleness is not the presence of estrogen so much as it is the absence of testosterone, although, of course, we know that estrogen is involved in making it work, right? Okay, so what kind of evidence do we have? Well, every once in a while, somebody shoots themselves up with testosterone at exactly the wrong point in development, and guess what happens? You can flip the anatomical sex of a baby. So, for instance, let's say you've got a female athlete who doesn't know that she's pregnant and is actually using testosterone to build muscle mass. If that happens at about 6 weeks post-implantation, she can flip the anatomical sex of the baby. Now, that is problematic. It's not just like, oh, I was going to have a girl and now I have a boy, because now what you have is the anatomical framework for being a boy, but then if the boy develops normally and hits puberty, he's not going to make high levels of testosterone, right? So what you have done is just made someone who is anatomically ambiguous, right, and is not going to have normal sexual development, okay? Because we will see that you have to turn all the stuff right back on at puberty and if you want to continue the secondary sex characteristics. Is that okay? Okay, so the other evidence that we have, and this one brings up a really important conversation to me. I don't know all the answers to these questions, but I think they're interesting questions. So I studied genetics before I studied anatomy and physiology, and one of the the genetic disorders that we studied was something called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Androgens are the male group of hormones that include testosterone, okay? All right, so this is a genetic disorder in which a mutation causes the testosterone androgen receptors to not work. So here's what we have. So stick with me. We have an XY baby. That's why you're making testosterone, right? You have an XY baby, okay? And with the XY baby, just follow me. The receptors for testosterone don't work, but everything else works as normal, okay? So with that XY baby, they are going to have SRY, right? SRY, yeah? And then SRY is going to be produced, and the testes will start to differentiate, but they won't be able to get all the way there. And then importantly, you are going to produce and respond to MIH, Mullerian inhibiting hormone. So what's going to happen to the fallopian tubes in the uterus? It's going to disintegrate, yes? Okay. But then I am going to start releasing testosterone to try to continue the development of the male, and I can't respond to it. So the important thing for you to understand is I just disintegrated the female portions, and I've still got a blind vagina, but I don't have, and it's a short vagina, because the top portion actually develops with the female parts. So you got a blind vagina, you don't have a uterus, you don't have fallopian tubes. You've got gonads that aren't quite sure what they're supposed to do, right? They're like, I was an ovary, but I'm not quite a testicle, what the hell am I, right? And then the external genitalia, if it doesn't respond to testosterone, how's it going to develop? How is it going to develop? What's it going to look like? What is the default? Yeah, it's going to develop like this, okay? So here's the thing that you need to know about these people. They're going to be born as babies, and they are going to have female junk, and nobody goes looking for a uterus when a baby girl is born, right? They just don't, okay? So she's born, and you name her Susie, and you raise her as a girl. And then when do you figure all this stuff out? Well, usually because when she's supposed to start menstruating, she still hasn't menstruated at 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 16. And then somebody takes her to the doctor, and they quickly figure out that she doesn't have a uterus, right? Okay. Now, is she a she? This is an interesting question. One of the things that I can tell you about this is that she is XY, but the vast majority of people with androgen insensitivity syndrome actually identify as female, which gives us a question that I don't know the answer to, but it certainly suggests, does it not, that perhaps the default psychological gender in humans is what? Female. And perhaps, it is not just the presence of testosterone, but the response of testosterone that allows for the gender identity to go on psychologically. Because only about 10% of these girls actually identify as male.
Can you repeat that?
I don't know what I said.
Well, darn it. You said,
Okay. So these girls are born, and they're raised as girls. And by the way, they get relatively tall. They hit puberty a little later than most girls, because boys do, right? One of the things that happens with them is, I don't know if you know this, but from physiology, testosterone can be converted into estrogen, and her estrogen receptors work just fine, okay? So she's going to hit puberty a little later, because boys do, right? And she's going to secrete massive amounts of testosterone, because boys do, yes? For a longer amount of time, right? And so she's going to get a little taller than most girls, and all of that testosterone, or most of it, is going to get converted into estrogen, right? And so she's going to develop relatively large breasts, right? Kind of tall, large breasts. She's a little supermodel is what she is. But almost all of those girls gender identify as female, which suggests, but does not confirm, that perhaps if we have XY and testosterone, it is not chromosomes that tell you that you're male, and it's not just the presence of testosterone that tells you that you're male, but the response to testosterone. And they think, but do not know yet, that actually happens a few weeks later than putting the junk together. And they think that in part because of model animals, and also in part because the brain isn't really very developed yet at that point, right? So we do think that in this particular situation, it's suggested, and preliminary evidence suggests, that perhaps gender identification has to do with not just chromosomal environment, but also response to chromosomal environment. Which brings us to the question, again, I don't know the answer, of is this girl transgender? Is she? Well, that would be for her to tell us, but transgender typically means that one of the anatomical determinants of sex does not agree with what you identify with. Yes? So is she, at least theoretically, one of the components that could define as transgender? Because she's XY with high levels of testosterone, but she gender identifies as female. Yes? And so the reason I like to go through this is because if this is one of the ways that we can conceptualize that a person could become transgender, do you think that it's the only way that a person could become transgender? Right? We can be creative enough that it allows us to conceptualize that if this is one physiological way that I can conceptualize transgender, and instead of being really, really judgmental about it, come up with some position of compassion that has some biological basis to support it. There are probably others that we don't know about yet. So how does gender determination occur? We don't know yet, but this one tells us that perhaps it has something to do with response to hormones at exactly the right point. So with that in mind, do you think it ever could even theoretically occur that your testosterone receptors could work here and not here? Yeah, right? It could work, right? And I don't know that answer. I just know that question. That's all I know about that. Okay, but we will talk about what transgender actually means in just a second. Okay, so another situation in which pregnant woman injected with testosterone flips the anatomical gender. And then we can talk about the concept of hermaphroditism and pseudohermaphroditism, which are now usually called intersex. Okay, so before we get to transgender and intersex and all that kind of stuff, what happens after this with the typical anatomical development, right? Just typical anatomical development. Basically, after you get everything in place, right? Okay, then really your gonads don't do anything until puberty. And you really do not have appreciably different levels of testosterone and estrogen anytime during childhood compared to any other child. So what happens is until puberty, they're just kind of sitting around there, just like doing nothing, right? And what happens at puberty is that your brain, your hypothalamus specifically, starts to make a hormone called GnRH, which is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and it starts to activate the whole cascade, which will cause the secondary sex development, right? And eventually turn on fertility, right? That makes sense? So everything is pretty much just sort of in a holding pattern until then. Okay, so now let's talk about some stuff that people ask about. And a lot of this is outside of my realm of expertise, but it is stuff that I did read literature on. So you may know that more than I do, and I'm totally comfortable with that, and you can tell me if you do, okay? So brain gender determination is what we just talked about. This is still preliminary evidence. We are confused about brain gender determination because we don't have a good model organism. Because if you ask a mouse that looks male, if he is male, he says squeak, and it doesn't tell you a damn thing, right? So you don't know, right? So you actually have to ask a human. And if a human tells you that they are male or female and you say no, I don't know how you think that you would know that better than they do, right? If someone asks you and you answer and they say no, it makes absolutely no difference what they say, right? Just like asking you your sexual orientation. And I say, well, I'm pretty heterosexual, and they say, no, you're not. And I'm like, well, I don't know why you asked me, because I am literally the expert on this. So with brain gender determination, there's still an awful lot of questions out there. There are also a few suggestions to answers and probably some science that we can look at. But now let's look at sexes. Is every person either male or female? No, there are actually anatomical differences between males and females, and sometimes you are in between. Yes, sometimes you had a clitoris that isn't exactly a clitoris, but isn't exactly a penis. For instance, perhaps it's a little larger, but the urethra is not in it, right? Okay. Perhaps you have what looks like a scrotum, but there are no testes in it. Okay. Perhaps you've got partial development of the internal ductwork, but it's not either male or female. In those situations, the typical noun for that is intersex, as in between the sexes. Yes? Do intersex people exist? Yes. They estimated, last time I read, it was around 25% of us have anatomical variation that could be like considered intersex. And just conceptually, any idea which chromosomal complement, XX or XY, is more likely to result in something that is in between? Yeah, it's XY. Yeah? Because you have to flip 2 switches to become a typical anatomical male. What if you flipped MIH, but you didn't support it with lots of testosterone? Well, then you're going to disintegrate the female portions, but you're not going to completely support the development of the male portions. And this, I know people get exhausted with this, and you probably have an uncle that thinks all of this is fiction, right? LGBTQIA. This is the I, intersex. Yeah? Okay, so intersex is a thing. It's an anatomical and scientific truth that people who are intersex absolutely do exist. The tragedy of people who are intersex is that quite often when a baby is born intersex and you can't tell whether they are meant to be a male or meant to be female, right? Historically speaking, what did they do to babies that were born intersex? They would decide. And what's the easiest gender to make functional? Yeah, they just cut everything off. But remember what you just told me? People who are intersex are even more likely to be XY than they are XX. Yeah? And then let's say that they got almost there, for instance, and it wasn't quite exactly a penis and a scrotum with testes that are descended, but their brain got that spike of testosterone. Then you raise them and you tell them their name is Susie, and then immediately when they start being able to like figure out who the hell they are, if I tell you your name is Susie, you're like, screw you, I'm not Susie. I'm literally not, right? And so what happened, right, is a lot of those historically had all kinds of psychological problems when you just anatomically just decided arbitrarily that they were a certain sex and then raised them as a certain gender. It doesn't work any better than it would work with you, right? So now they try super duper hard not to do that. They try to let the babies gender identify before you actually figure out how to raise them, which is difficult, right? Because what's the first question everybody asks you about your baby? Is it a boy or a girl? You're like, we'll ask her when she can talk. Them. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I just take a minute and share something from
Sure.
the normal psychology class? So, and it's along this line with transgender. So, when I was doing my abnormal psychology class,
Cool.
we got to choose a pathology to study. And because my son is fabulous, I thought, well, and he's too young to know like what his but he is pretty fabulous.
I liked him a lot.
Anyway, I decided that I wanted to study transgender so that I would know it better, and so that I would understand kind of what have some basis of knowledge. And so we did talk about. I learned about one of these very first babies who had like
an intersex baby.
Pediatric
Mm-hmm.
surgery, and he was raised as a boy. chose an identity. I guess they chose a female identity, but he identified as a boy. And so years went by. He was like 16 or 17 before he even found out what his parents had done, because at that time there was so much, shrouding of information around it that they just didn't even tell him what happened. So when he finally found out, then he was like, oh, well, that's great, that's awesome. However, the kind of the effects of having been raised contrary to his actual identification was, it took such a toll on him. He actually ended up committing suicide.
It's very common with those intersex surgeries.
In his 20s. It's very distressing, as you can imagine. As the example that you gave, if someone is telling you all the time you're homosexual and you're not, and they're trying to make you behave in a homosexual way, that would be very distressing for you. It's just easy to dismiss it because, the majority of the population is heterosexual.
Right. Right. Okay, so let's talk about, so we were talking about intersex situations. Let's talk about cis versus transgender situations, because that's actually different than intersex. This is one of the things that I educated myself on. Okay, you may have never heard the word cisgender before. I didn't even know it before a few years ago. And so what is transgender and what is cisgender, and what does that have to do with intersex? With intersex, it means that basically your anatomy was never quite male or female, right? Okay. And with that in mind, if you were intersex, you could either identify as male or female, and you might want to wait until they tell you which one before you try to make some corrective surgery. But with someone who is transgender, what happens is your anatomical, your biological sex disagrees with your gender identification. Yes? And so, yes, you may have external genitalia that looks male, right? But your brain is female. Your brain identifies as female. Okay? And this is a really uncomfortable subject for some people, but I want you to understand that even though we're talking about it now on social media and your uncle gets to argue about it, it has existed throughout history. People who are transgender have existed throughout history. So what happens here is an individual sense of identifying with the same gender. So if I present as female, and I also identify as female, then I am considered cisgender, cis as in same. If I appear as female and I identify as male, then I am transgender. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what cis versus trans is. Do we know absolutely what would cause someone to identify as a gender that is different than their anatomical sex? We do not know, right? But we do have a couple of suggestions, including that situation that I told you about with androgen insensitivity syndrome, right? Okay, developed here, right? But you didn't actually have the identification that occurred here. So this is what transgender is, okay? And transgender is different than intersex, right? Intersex means it wasn't developed one way or the other. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what transgender versus cisgender is. One of the possible lines of research for transgender versus cisgender is, did, for instance, the testosterone work here but not here? Yes? And then you could imagine you have a situation in which a person is anatomically male but gender identifies as female, and that would be a trans female if they chose to identify that way. We know even less about trans males, less about it. Why would someone anatomically be female and gender identify as male? We don't know, right? And interestingly, a bunch of this research has not been done yet. So we would like to have a lot of research to be done on this. They think that there are actually some anatomical brain differences between trans people and people who are not trans. But you'd actually have to have a lot of money for MRIs and a lot of money for post-mortem studies to, for instance, compare the brain of a trans male to a typical female to a typical anatomical male. And as far as I know, we have only had 12 people, 12 trans males that have donated their brains for that purpose. So we still got far more questions than we have answers. But I think questions are humble. That's what I think about the situation. Assuming that you have the answer to a situation that you have never experienced and has never actually been researched is probably pretty egotistical from my perspective. So I don't know the answer, and that's fine. There are lots of things I don't know the answer to. Okay, so The last one is sexual orientation. This is not something that we have a known anatomical or physiological basis on, but the reason I want to talk about it is because it gets confused with all of these other things. It is absolutely out of my realm of expertise, but since it gets confused with all of these things, I want to make sure that we differentiate it from all of those things, okay? So with sexual orientation, it's a separate issue from sex, and it's a separate issue from gender, yes? It has to do with who you are sexually attracted to, yes? Okay, so I could be a cis female who is attracted to males, and then I would be typically heterosexual, yes? I could be a cis female who is attracted to females, and then I might define myself as homosexual, yeah? Okay. But I could also be a trans female who was attracted to males, and then I would define myself however the hell I wanted, because cis versus trans does not predict your attraction to other people, right? Does that make sense? Good. So trans doesn't really, it's not answering the question of sexual orientation. It's a different question, who you're attracted to. Does that make sense? Okay. So separate issue than sex or gender, and male, female, intersex, trans, cis, anybody can be attracted to anybody, and it's a separate question. Go ahead.
And do we have information as to what causes heterosexuality versus homosexuality?
We do not. Interestingly, it's such a politically fraught question that when anybody thinks they have the answer, it ends up sort of ostracizing one group of people. So if we, for instance, say, hey, heterosexual people's brains are decidedly different than homosexual people's brains, then we say, oh, okay, well, apparently that's just an abnormality, and we can socially ostracize it, try to figure out how to fix it, right? Or they're the same, which means, oh, it's a choice, so you are behaving in a way that I disapprove of, right? So is there a right answer or a wrong answer? Well, first of all, there isn't an answer anyway, yet. It's probably physiological. Everything's physiological, right? Like just everything, neurotransmitters and physiology. But we don't actually have the answer. But in addition, it does not seem to be a bimodal distribution. It's not two boxes. This is super uncomfortable for people, but I'm going to go ahead and show you, and I'm not going to test you over it, and you can write your congressman about it. FYI, this is the Kinsey Scale, brought up the first time in the 40s and 50s. And if you ask people over and over again, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, most people do not identify what they are attracted to as exclusively heterosexual versus exclusively homosexual. Most people are not a 0 and they're not a 1. Most people are somewhere in between. This does not mean that you are having sex with other people. It means if I get you in an environment in which I ask you enough questions, will you tell me that you exclusively always are here or exclusively always are there? There are not very many people that are at either end. Not surprisingly, because there's 7.5 billion people on the planet, there are more people who are heterosexual on this end than there are who are homosexual on that end. There are more, right? But there are not 0 over there, and there are not 100% over here. And guess what? Uncomfortable thing coming. Guess when in your life you are more likely to fall somewhere toward the middle? No, not puberty. No. Yes, exactly, in your 20s. Yeah, in your 20s is usually when you fall kind of here. And usually you settle a little more one way than the other. And there are a few people who are like, hell no, other sexes are gross. Hell no, the same sex is gross. But there aren't that many of them. Does that make sense? And they keep doing the Kinsey Scale over and over and over and over again. And you're like, hey, people just need to honestly report. Well, they keep honestly reporting, and it keeps them being a spectrum and not a bimodal distribution, which is kind of interesting to talk about. And of course, you can't talk about that in Utah schools, but you guys are not in public school. You're in college. Go ahead.
Is it 20s because your frontal lobe hasn't finished?
People tend to be far more experimental in all ways in their 20s. And they tend to like be more experimental and more risk-taking in their 20s. And they're more likely, right? And also a lot of synaptic pruning is still going on. But you usually don't like start out here and end up here anyway, right? You might be here in your 20s and end up right there, right? You're just like, oh, I'm right there. Or you might be right here and end up right there, right? So people, depending on their ages, tend to fall at different places. So that's the Kinsey scale. A lot of people say it's not scientifically valid, and that's fine. It is just compiling data over time. And you guys can go look it up. It's still going. They still do the Kinsey tests all the time. I would love to take one. I'd love to see where I fall on that. Like enough honest questions and see where I fall. Okay, so that's called the Kinsey scale. All right, so all of this stuff is related to both sex, gender, and sexuality. But now what we are going to do is we are going to get into the typical anatomical female and the typical anatomical male, right? Okay, just the typical one. Okay, so we're going to start with female reproductive system anatomy. And there's some interesting history that goes into this. I like obsessively read about human sexuality. Oh, I want to tell you something else that's weird. You ready for something weird? Are you going to get offended? Guess what? In mammalian populations, perhaps including humans, with just an asterisk because I don't know, guess what starts to happen as populations get very crowded? More homosexuality. And why? Why would that be an evolutionary strategy? Yeah, babies are resource expensive. So as you start to get really, really crowded populations in mammal after mammal after mammal after mammal, homosexuality starts to become far more common. Which is interesting. It's like, when does it occur? I don't know. Does it occur because I didn't have enough food? Does it occur because of this? Does it occur because of that? And here's one that's not very common and not very popular. The more babies you have, the more likely you are for your youngest children to be homosexual. If you have, especially if you have like 6 boys, they've only studied it in males. If you have like 6 boys, number 6, way more likely to be gay than number 1. Don't know why. Can't tell you. Go look up the literature and just write to your congressman about how horrible I am. Go ahead.
My husband's uncles, well, he has 7 uncles and aunts. Out of the 7 children, 4 of them identify as
Gay? Homosexual. Interesting.
One of them actually will do it.
So this is like, we do not know what that is, but it is not uncommon in other species. So just throw it out there and just do what you want with it. Okay, so last little tidbit, and this is just based on actual like history. This is a really interesting thing. So we're going to get into female reproductive system anatomy, which is super duper interesting. It's also really, really commonly misunderstood. And one of the reasons it's commonly misunderstood is that the female reproductive system anatomy has been taught differently at different points in history, but not because of ignorance, but because of social pressure. Okay, so in the last class I talked about this. Do you know Grey's Anatomy? Not the show, the book. You do? Okay, thank you. They thought when I said Grey's Anatomy, everybody thought I was talking about the show, and I was talking about the 1800s, and they're like, no, wait, Derek was only whatever. No, so Grey's Anatomy, the show, is named a pun after Grey's Anatomy, the book, that used to be kind of the Bible for anatomy. And I've got one in my office, and it's been around since, I think, the late 1800s, although I can't quite remember. So, Gray, can't remember his first name, Dr. Gray is really, really good at drawing these specific anatomical drawings, right? Okay, so this book has been around for a long, long time, and long before photography, it was the common anatomical textbook for doctors and for training them. And I think it's now in like, it's 90th or something edition. I don't know. But if you look at Grey's Anatomy over time, depending on whether we were in a very culturally conservative time or not, the clitoris totally disappears. And then it comes back. And then it totally disappears. And then it comes back. So you have entire generations of doctors that were not taught portions of the female anatomy, because the clitoris, of course, doesn't have anything to do directly with reproduction. It's only for pleasure. And so they just didn't even teach. It's just like absent. I actually have the journal article that shows you like through history, like what Grey's Anatomy. So generations, for instance, like in the 1950s, super duper conservative, right? 1950s, clitoris goes away. Mid-60s, sexual revolution, clitoris comes back. Go a little later in the 80s, disappears again. Then it comes back. So we have this sort of historical, and it didn't happen to the penis. Like everybody knows where the penis is, right? But not only did they erase the clitoris, they also erased all the internal erectile structures of the female. So you just learned sort of false anatomy, basically. So one of the reasons that your grandma knows less than you think that she knows is because the people that taught her knew less than we know now. But now the internet exists, right? So is the clitoris ever really going to go away again? No, it's not. It might disappear from your textbook, but get a different textbook. Okay, so female reproductive system anatomy. So a couple of functions. The other reason the female reproductive system is a little confusing is internal, right? Hard to see. And it has 3 functions instead of 2. The male reproductive system produces sex hormones and produces gametes, right? But the female reproductive system also has to be able to prepare for and support a developing embryo fetus baby, right? Okay, so it's also sort of obfuscated and you can't quite see it. So before we get into the actual anatomy, I want to briefly, because this is super duper complicated, so I'm going to do a short version of it, talk about what the menstrual cycle is, okay? And then we'll actually get into the straight anatomy. So the menstrual cycle, 28-ish days in length. And what I want you to understand about the menstrual cycle is, what the menstrual cycle is the ovaries bossing the uterus around via primarily the hormone progesterone. So short version of what's happening with the menstrual cycle. Every cycle with a woman, let's say it's 28 days, could vary, you're going to have meiosis occur, right? So you're taking one 46 chromosome cell and going through meiosis so that it's got 23 chromosomes, and then eventually you will ovulate it, right? From the ovary, you guys with me? Okay, eventually you're going to ovulate it, okay? But what this needs to do is this is a potential fertilization, potential zygote, right? What this needs to do is if fertilization occurs, it needs to have a little place to land, yes? And so fertilization might occur and then you need to land it in a nice thick uterus. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so here's what happens. Right about the time ovulation is occurring, okay, it is going to communicate to the uterus. The ovary is going to release progesterone, and progesterone is progestation. Progestation, yeah? And what it tells the uterus is to get ready. Red Rover, Junior might be coming over. And it thickens, yeah, and increases blood flow to the wall of the uterus, right? And then it just waits to see if implantation occurs. And usually, basically, there's like a week, maybe 8-10 days in which it could occur. So the woman ovulates, it goes from the ovary, it goes through the fallopian tube. If fertilization occurs, it usually occurs up here in the fallopian tube, okay? And then it's going to take anywhere between 2 days and 7 days to get down into the uterus, right? So at that point, you're like proliferating and thickening the lining of the uterus. Okay, if implantation occurs, then you're pregnant. If implantation does not occur, your body doesn't even know that fertilization occurred, right? Only about 50% of fertilization events ever implant. So if you got 3 kids, in all likelihood, you had at least 6 fertilizations, right? Sometimes they just don't catch the wall. If they do catch the wall and implant, yeah, then your progesterone should stay high, progestation, throughout the entire pregnancy. If, however, the window has passed in which an implantation could occur, what is going to occur is your progesterone level is going to drop, yeah? You're going to menstruate and say, maybe next time, and then you're going to start the whole damn thing over again, right? So the menstrual cycle, again, is the ovary pushing the uterus around primarily with the hormone progesterone. Progesterone. Good? Does that make sense? Okay, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. I spent almost a whole semester on this crap in college. But, I mean, that's a good simplified version. Okay? Everybody good? Okay, so now what we are going to do is we are going to start talking about the female genitalia, and we're going to talk about the vulva. So, here's a vulva. Woo! Okay, so the vulva is, so this is not your vagina. I know everybody calls it the vagina, but if you're looking at somebody's vagina, you're either got a speculum or a camera and you're looking up in there. This whole part right here is not the vagina. That's the vagina, okay? This is called the vulva, okay? The external genitalia of the female. Of course, historically, this was called the pudendum. We don't call it that anymore because pudendum means shameful. And a bunch of old Catholic monks named your junk shameful. And they named their junk awesome. No, they didn't. But they didn't name it shameful, I'll tell you that. So we try to get away from the word pudendum, but of course we still have the pudendal nerve and that kind of stuff. We just haven't renamed all of that stuff. So this is the vulva. Now, of course, the portions of the vulva, let's talk about them. So this whole portion is the vulva. This portion right here is called the mons pubis. Mons means mountain. And it's basically a fat pad that sits on top of the pubic symphysis because we are one of the few species that at least sometimes has sex face-to-face. And ouch, right? So a fat pad developed there in the female. A male has a little bit of a fat pad too, but the female has a bigger fat pad on top. So that's called the mons pubis, okay? Of course, you're going to grow pubic hair of the mons pubis after puberty, okay? And then let's go into the other portions. So the labia majora here, yeah? Or homologous with what male structure? Scrotum, exactly. The labia minora here are homologous with what male structure? The skin around the shaft of the penis. You can't exactly say that they're homologous with the penis because the erectile structures come from somewhere else. So we have to sort of talk about it a little bit more carefully than that. Is that okay? Okay, and then this is the clitoris. It's really only the glands of the clitoris. We'll look at the whole internal structure in just a minute. Okay, and then this is the vestibule inside the labia minora. Vestibule means waiting room. Where's the doorbell for the waiting room, guys? Right there. They used to call it the devil's doorbell too. People who didn't want you to find it, they called it the devil's doorbell. Okay, well, you got to ring the door or else you're not going to get any of your packages in. That's what I'm saying, all right? So that's the clitoris. This is the vestibule. Okay, so let's see what's in the vestibule. Stuff that you know and stuff that I didn't know for a long, long time. Of course, you guys know. That's the external urethral orifice, also called the urethral opening, right? This is the vaginal orifice. Okay, that's the vaginal orifice with the hymen gone. We'll talk about the hymen a little bit in just a second. But what most people don't know, and I didn't know for a really long time, is that there is actually openings to glands right there. Okay, this is the opening for the greater vestibular glands. When a woman is aroused, okay, what happens is these secrete a clear lubricating fluid that lubricates the opening of the vagina. Okay, those are homologous to the male bulbourethral glands, which, when a male is aroused, do what? Cleanse the urethra, lubricate the tip of the penis. So if you are doing it well and everybody is anatomically and physiologically functional, both people will A, have erections, and B, be moist, right? Evolutionarily, that's how it developed. So the greater vestibular glands, just so you know, where they are, if you take off all the skins, they're these guys right back here, and they dump in right there. That's the greater vestibular glands. That's where those are. Good? Okay, so there's a couple more things in there that we will learn. Okay, so the vestibule, we got the greater vestibular glands, and then let's learn the first erectile structures. The first erectile structures that you guys are going to learn are these guys right here in purple. Do you see them? Okay. These are called the bulbs of the vestibule. They are homologous to the male corpus spongiosum that surrounds the urethra, right? It's one of the male erectile structures, right? The corpus spongiosum. So in a male, they end up, the corpus spongiosum ends up in the penis. Here in a female, it ends up around the opening of the vagina. These are called the bulbs of the vestibule. Sometimes they're considered part of the clitoral structure just because they are actually erectile tissue. So let's look at them and think about this. And I didn't know that we had these either until I started studying the anatomy. These are the bulbs of the vestibule. And when a woman is aroused, they will become engorged with blood, basically erect, but behind the skin. What is the evolutionary reason for that? What would that do for you? When the bulbs of the vestibules become engorged with blood, what does it do? It increases sensitivity. Think about intercourse. What would it do to the likelihood of ejaculation in the male?
Probably speed it up.
Yeah.
Have a higher likelihood.
Right. So it actually sort of closes, narrows the opening to the vagina when the woman is aroused and increases the likelihood of ejaculation. Yes? Okay. So not surprisingly, we have figured out that women who are aroused tend to be more fertile. Yeah? Do you have to be aroused in order to, for instance, get pregnant? No, of course you don't. And I would like to talk to the management about that, okay? I would like to talk to someone about that. So these are the bulbs of the vestibule. They are homologous to the corpus spongiosum in the male. Okay, and we'll talk about the rest of the erectile structures in just a second. Now, let me talk to you about one controversial structure. We know it exists in some women. We have not done enough studies, either anatomically or physiologically, to know how many women it exists in, and people are still arguing about whether it exists in this one versus the next one. We need some money. We need some post-mortem studies to do this, because basically what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at post-mortem histology. So let me show you this structure. And I don't know how many women exist in. It's more than 0. So this structure right here is a structure called the Skeins Gland or the paraurethral glands. And when it exists, it's a little bit of epithelial, glandular epithelium that's sort of in the connective tissue there, homologous to the male prostate gland. And in the same place, yes, as the male prostate gland? Okay, so why the hell do we care about this? We care about this because this is the source of the legendary female ejaculation. Some women, when they become aroused and stimulated in specific ways, they will ejaculate fluid, but it doesn't come from the distal end of their vagina, it comes from the distal end of their urethra, which can be confusing as hell. You're like, every time I have an orgasm, I pee myself. You didn't pee yourself because they've actually analyzed the fluid, and if it was pee, it would have a high concentration of urea, yeah, and should have no PSA, which is prostate-specific antigen. But female ejaculate actually has a decent amount of PSA in it, prostate-specific antigen. But we don't know how many women have this. So you can read the research articles and they're like, as of 1990, we cannot confirm or deny because there hasn't been enough research done in it, okay? And this research is not gonna go on in Utah, let's just be honest, right? It's not gonna, okay? Because of course this isn't directly involved in reproduction as well either. Okay, so that's the paraurethral greater vestibular glands. Okay, now let's talk about the clitoris. Okay, the clitoris is more than you think it is. It is more than most people know it is. And if you show people a picture of one, they ain't gonna know what the hell it is. And even when I was learning anatomy and they knew the structure, I think people are just uncomfortable and they're like, let's just not talk about that. But let's talk about it. Okay, so the clitoris, guys, what we usually refer to as the clitoris is just this little structure right here that's covered with a prepuce when the woman is not aroused. And the prepuce is a covering of tissue that when the woman is not aroused, partially or completely covers the glands of the clitoris, right? But what the clitoris actually is a bunch of erectile structures, most of which are behind the body wall, okay? So can you see that the clitoris just looks like a little penis? Yeah? So you no need for penis envy because everybody has one, okay? We've all got one, okay? And by the way, when people say clitoris, collectively, a lot of times they're meaning all of the erectile structures, okay? Which often they throw in the bulbs of the vestibule with it, okay? So those are the bulbs of the vestibule. We already talked about this, but I want to talk about how the clitoris actually is erectile structures that is really similar to the penis. Okay, so you may or may not have learned how the penis erection occurs, but we're going to talk about it in detail later. So here's my metaphor for how a penis erection goes. Did you guys do this in lab yet? If you haven't, okay. So here's the deal. You have this erectile structure, which is called the crus or crura, and it's smashed up against the pelvic girdle, okay, and it stays there, okay? It's erectile tissue. And it is continuous with the erectile tissue that goes into the clitoris or the penis. So let's talk about a penis first, because everybody's seen a penis. Ready? Okay, so with the penis, what you have is two erectile bodies called the crus or crura of the penis that are continuous with the erectile structures called the corpus spongiosum that goes paired corpora cavernosa that go into the penis. So basically what we have is two blow-up floats, yes? So I want you to imagine that the blow-up float is stuck against the wall, yeah? This is what I'm using as leverage. And it's staying stuck to the wall. And then I start to blow it up, right? And you're gonna use the wall as leverage, and then it's gonna stand up, yeah? Because part of the erectile structures are behind the body wall and part of them are in the penis, yes? So that's how an erection works in males. It's not blowing up, of course, though it's filling with blood, right? But I want you to understand that the same thing exists in females. So this erectile tissue is continuous with the erectile tissue that's actually in the body of the clitoris and the glands of the clitoris. And when a woman becomes aroused, this becomes engorged with blood and her clitoris actually stands up. So a female actually has an erection too. Yes? And she has erectile tissue here and she has an erectile tissue there. So, and of course we have on both campuses, have you seen the model for the clitoris? I don't think any place else has those because that 3D model came from a research study that was done 3 or 4 years ago in France. And a female reproductive biologist went and did tons and tons of MRIs to figure out what the reproductive structures and the erectile structures of a female looked like when they were aroused versus not aroused. And then she actually uploaded that data so that people could download and print 3D models of the female erectile structures. And I printed them, 2 for each campus, and you probably won't see them anywhere else. So they're on both campuses, and you can see them. I also have a necklace coming that's the female erectile structures, because you know me and my nerd necklaces. It's just like this big. Nobody's going to know what it is, right? My husband likes, it looks like an upside-down heart or a wishbone. I'm like, okay. That'll make it more socially appropriate when I wear it to your parents' house. Okay. It's silver, but they made it, it's like coming from Sweden, because of course, I had to go to Sweden to get it. So hopefully it'll be here before Monday and I'll get to show you guys. So I don't have a reproductive necklace. I need one. Okay, so the clitoris. Now, what is interesting about the clitoris is a couple of things. First off, it has 8,000 sensory nerve endings in the glans clitoris. 8,000 sensory nerve endings in the glans clitoris. Male glans penis has the same amount, but it's spread out, right? Does that make sense? So not quite as concentrated as sensory nerve endings. And it's got a body, right? And then glands, which is the head. And then, of course, the erectile tissues continues to go back in there. Now, the one thing I want to talk about before we leave the clitoris and get into the ovaries is, so culturally significant. In some cultures, people choose to do what they call female circumcision, or FGM, which is female genital mutilation. Does anybody know what that is anatomically? I am not making any cultural judgments. I just want us to actually talk about what's going on. Go ahead.
So female genital mutilation or female circumcision, they either sew the lips of the labia minora closed or cut out the clitoris.
Yes, or any combination of those. So what happens in multiple different cultures in multiple places in the world. And by the way, there is a federal court case going on in Minnesota right now about a pair of doctors that did this consensually, right? But consensually with like 11 and 12-year-old girls who might not know what they're consenting to. So there is a federal court case going on right then. They just said last week that they could continue to do it. So anyway, here's what happens. Depending on what culture you're talking about, generally they will remove the external portion of the clitoris, the entire thing. And sometimes they remove the labia minora, sometimes they sew them shut, and sometimes they sew the vagina partially shut as well. And culturally, this is quite often done from one generation of women to the next generation of girls, to the next generation of girls, to the next generation of girls. And culturally, quite often it is what's considered, what makes the girl marriageable. And in some cultures, unless she has had this done, she is not considered marriageable. Does that make, do you understand it? Not does it make logical sense to you, but do you understand what I'm saying? And so the question that immediately comes up is why? Why would this have been culturally common? Does anybody have any idea why it might have become culturally common? Protecting their virginity, and even after, right? After you're already married, why does this?
Because in some cultures, the existence of like pleasure or whatever can be considered a sin, so that's why they would cut out.
Yeah, and they also think it's more likely to keep people faithful, right? To keep women faithful to the person that they married. What?
Women.
Yes, women being the operative word. So it's really interesting, culturally significant. I'm not going to tell you what opinion you need to have on such things, especially when they are not my culture, right? And I am no expert on things that are not my culture at all. However, I do want you to understand what people are talking about when they say those kinds of things, and then you can make your own opinions, right? Go ahead.
Would that have any effect on them not menstruating if they showed their...
No, the clitoris doesn't have it. The interesting thing about the clitoris is its only function is pleasure.
Or, like, do they...
Oh, if they sew this, yeah, if they sew it all the way shut, then you are going to have problems with menstruating. Either you are going to end up with an infection, and quite often, by the way, this is not done in sterile situations. And a lot of times girls end up with infections and dying because of this. Now, this woman who's doing it in Minnesota is a doctor, so she was doing it in sterile situations, and she was doing it at the request of the children's parents. Right? But if you sew this all the way up, either you're going to menstruate if you only have a small opening for like 3 weeks out of your cycle, or you are going to end up not being able to menstruate at all. So this is an interesting thing, and you will see things. Now that you know it, it's like red car syndrome. You will see it coming up in the news, and you can figure out what you think about it and whether there's anything you want to do about it, but at least you know what it is now and how it's related to anatomy. Okay, so ovaries are next. Let's talk about the ovaries. Okay. So your ovaries, where are you? Ovaries are homologous to what male structure? Yeah, they are homologous to the testes. They're actually smaller than the testes, and they're actually smaller than you expect them to be. They're relatively tiny, and they have the texture of like, it's gross, but large curd cottage cheese. That's what they look like. They're kind of lumpy and white. And they're lumpy because you've always got these in partial stages of development in a woman who is still reproductively viable. So I want to talk about what they do. So the ovaries produce gametes, which is oocytes or ova, right? And they also produce progesterone and estrogen, and also some other hormones, but those are the two big ones. Interestingly, as far as the anatomy goes, so if I'm a uterus and these are my fallopian tubes, my ovaries would be right here, right? Okay, but they actually are not attached to your fallopian tubes or oviducts. Your fallopian tubes or oviducts will fold over them under high levels of progesterone, but they're never like stuck to each other, which means, interestingly, that when you ovulate, you actually ovulate into your peritoneal cavity. And what happens is you try to get it into the tube. And since you ovulate into the peritoneal cavity and these are not closed, can it ever happen that fertilization can happen outside of the reproductive tract? Yes. And if implantation happens outside of the reproductive tract, it can, for instance, implant on your colon, your urinary bladder, your mesentery. It can implant in there. If it does, you will pee on a stick and get a positive pregnancy result because the implantation causes the development of HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin. That is called an ectopic pregnancy. Ectopic means out of place. The most common place for it to occur is actually in the tube, but it can occur out of the tube, right? So when that occurs, right, so what happens is it implants on multiple places, and it definitely occurs because the sperm can leave the female reproductive tract. That, with only one exception that I've ever heard of, cannot be carried to term. And the woman actually usually has to have surgical intervention very, very early on, or else she is going to die with that ectopic pregnancy. Go ahead.
Just curious with that, how does the pH of the rest of the body in the peritoneal cavity not affect the sperm?
It does most of the time, which is why it doesn't happen more frequently than they imagine, right? So, but your pH in your, FYI, your pH in your serous fluid is not dramatically different than the pH in the fallopian tubes because those are continuous with one another. The vagina is actually relatively acidic, but the uterus and the fallopian tubes are not that acidic. Does that make sense? Okay. The vagina is like the entrance, but the cervix sort of is the gatekeeper from there up. All right. So if that occurs, the woman generally needs some kind of surgical intervention in order for that to not die of it. Every once in a while, and I didn't believe this until I actually went and looked up the literature for it. There have been 2 instances that I know of that I could find in the literature that a woman has actually carried an ectopic pregnancy, not to term. It didn't go all the way to 40 weeks, but it went to viability. I think one of them was like 27 weeks. It's still really, really early to deliver a baby. So what happened is she had an ectopic pregnancy that actually implanted on the outside of her uterus. So it actually had blood supply, right? that it would normally have. Isn't that fascinating? And so she developed like the amniotic sac and everything on the outside of her uterus, and chose to carry it as long as she could. Really, really risky, by the way. Could have very easily died in the process. And I can't remember, there's 2 cases that I know of. The one that carried it to 27 weeks, of course it has to be surgically delivered. And it's not even a cesarean section because they didn't actually have to cut into her uterus. I don't know what you call it, an abdominal surgery, right? What?
I can't imagine how complicated it is.
I can't either. So that baby was delivered at 27 weeks. Of course, spent a lot of time in the NICU. And then that one survived. And the last time I checked was still alive, like survived infancy. But the other one was delivered at 20-something weeks and was delivered alive and then died relatively quickly after. And in both cases, the moms almost died during the whole process. It's like really, really difficult to actually survive that. So those are ectopic pregnancies. Okay, so as far as blood supply to the ovaries. So how do the ovaries get their blood supply? It probably doesn't surprise you. The ovarian arteries are the same as the gonadal arteries, right? So where do those branch from? Descending abdominal aorta, yeah, okay, or abdominal aorta, whatever you want to call it. And then there's one other little branch. It's the ovarian branch of the uterine arteries, which are branches off of the internal iliac. So the internal iliac also sends a branch there. As far as innervation, the innervation to the ovaries, they have motor innervation from the autonomic nervous system that seems to primarily control blood flow to them. But then they also have visceral sensory innervation. Some women can actually feel ovulation. Do you guys know that? Some women can actually feel it occur, because here's what ovulation is. It's pretty damn fascinating. So I'll show you guys this. Okay, so when you do ovulation, here's what happens. And you're going to learn the tissue layers next time. So you're going through development and meiosis, right? Okay. And then in order to get that out of the ovary and ultimately probably into the fallopian tube or oviduct, it has to bust through the side. And as it busts through the side, sometimes it hurts, and women can actually feel that ovulation. So this is what you're actually seeing right here. So I've got an actual picture of a woman ovary when they're doing harvesting. So you know when women are dealing with fertility issues, sometimes they take drugs like Clomid that make them hyperovulate, right? And then they have to go in and actually harvest the eggs for instance, in vitro fertilization. And here's a cool picture showing you how that occurs. So here's my ovary. Yeah, this little red bubble right here is this guy. Yeah, that's this big structure that's actually supporting the developing oocyte that's about to be ovulated. And then this little guy right here is actually the oocyte that's actually being ovulated. And it busts through the wall. And when that comes out, this thing is going to bust, and there's going to be fluid and a little bit of blood. So women can sometimes feel which one they ovulate from. And interestingly, which ovary you ovulate from is not like left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. Sometimes it's like left, 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 right, right, left, left, right, 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 right. Like you never know where it's coming from at all. And there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. What it primarily has to do with is which one has an egg that's almost ready, right? Because you're going to start working. Which egg is almost ready? Go ahead.
Okay, so I think that may have been taught a fallacy then.
Okay.
Like we're born with all of our eggs.
Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about that next time, but let's just talk about it briefly now. It is it's truthy, but not true. What you are born with is all of your egg-producing structures, these guys right here, okay? You are born with millions of those, and they age with you. But each month, in a typical female, what will happen is one of them will start to go through the process of meiosis to make an oocyte. Does that make sense? So you're born with all the egg-producing structures you're ever going to have. Those don't go through mitosis and make more, okay? But each month, on average, one of them will go through meiosis, okay? How's that different than a male? Because males are born with a whole bunch of those, the testicular equivalent, and we'll talk about those in just a second. And they go through meiosis with each one of them, but they also make new ones all the time, right? So the big difference is our egg-producing structures age with us, and their egg-producing structures are making fresh ones all the time and massive quantities of sperm. Fresh ones all the time, massive quantities of sperm. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so we will stop there and finish on Monday. Okay, you have a quiz due tonight. I don't remember what time. Make sure that you look, because I'm not gonna. And I'm going to go ahead and post your reproductive quiz. It's not going to be due Monday, but just so you can start looking at it. It won't be due until like next Tuesday. Okay? I'm going to post the reproductive quiz. You can like do the ones that you know right now and then listen on Monday and do the rest of them. Okay? So we'll finish up on Monday.